Hey everybody, hello and welcome to Virtual Coffee Lunch and Learn Edition. Virtual Coffee's mission is to be a welcoming tech community that allows room for growth and mentorship at all levels, and to create meaningful opportunities for learning, leadership, and contribution for everyone. To find our code of conduct, events, or to learn more, please check out our site at virtualcoffee.io. We're really glad to have you all here with us today, and I especially want to thank our presenter, Mark Noonan, for being here today. Mark's going to be talking about accessibility with complex components today. I'm personally really excited about this talk. I've done a lot of front end in the past, and I know this can get tricky and a little hairy sometimes. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. I asked Mark, and Mark, you said you're okay with questions throughout the presentation. That's right?
Yep. I will need someone to tell me the questions are there. I'm not very good at keeping up with the chat. So if you want to, if they show up, just feel free to interrupt me with them. That's fine.
Yeah, perfectly. I'll do that. I'll keep an eye on the chat. Without further ado, then I will let you go ahead and share your screen.
All right. We should be seeing a.
Yeah. Perfect.
There we go. Yeah. We're in the middle of a slideshow. There we go. All right. So yeah, let's get started then. The idea behind this talk is kind of what Nick alluded to, that as components get more complicated and as frameworks get more powerful, we spend a lot of time thinking about like the way the framework works and how our components are organized, maybe what our front-end architecture is. So we're maybe stuck in React or Vue kind of reactivity issues or performance type concerns. And the entities we're working with are often like, parent-child components that don't have, you're not looking at HTML as much, you're looking at components that call other components. And so one of the things that gets hard to maintain is like, what's the kind of accessible identity of components underneath the implementation? And how can we kind of focus on that and think about that as we're building? And also maybe that can guide us to write better code, simpler components, kind of solve things in an easier way. So to begin with, I'm just going to introduce myself briefly. I'm an engineer at Cypress. I work in the component testing team there. This talk will use Cypress a little bit, and the concepts apply in component testing or end-to-end testing, but it's not really a component testing talk. I have a couple of other organizations I'm involved with. I'm a program developer at People Making Progress. That is a nonprofit based in Atlanta that serves adults with developmental disabilities. And I volunteer at RefCode. RefCode is a nonprofit that's based in Clarkston, Georgia, and they teach refugees and immigrants programming skills and kind of career introduction to development. Here's what we're going to cover in the talk. I'll start with a background of what is web accessibility. This is for reasons that some people watching this might not have the background in it already. And also I have a particular angle on it. It's really too big to talk about all of it all at once. Then we'll talk about the code we write as communication, how that communicates between the developer and somebody using the application. And we'll talk about why patterns matter in UI development, especially. Like there's a lot of existing patterns that we can check out and they're really useful. Accessibility is one of the main reasons they're useful. And putting the user first in testing, this is kind of how we'll go to the maintenance part of it. So we have complicated component architectures. Our tests can help us define the behavior from a user-focused, accessibility-focused point of view. So when we have tests that do that and the framework needs to upgrade, or you need to move from React to Angular or something like that, if your tests are interacting with the same things the user is interacting with, you have a really good opportunity to refactor complicated components, change the architecture, but keep the behavior you're testing the same. And that makes maintenance a lot easier. It gives you something to focus on rather than testing framework-specific things that aren't that important. And finally, we'll just wrap it up with a summary and talk about some of the benefits of working in an accessible way. These are a mix between benefits for people who are actually using your software and also benefits for us as we're developing them. There's a bunch of stuff we're not going to get to. So we have the WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, that often come up when we think about accessibility. And we have things like ACTS and Lighthouse that can give you an accessibility score. Both of those have their place in like knowing if your work is accessible, but I think they actually have to come after the kind of thing we're going to talk about, where we have attempted to build a component in an accessible way, in a kind of coherent pattern that should work. And then these automated checks can tell us a little bit about how well we did or didn't do at that, but they're actually not very good at telling us that we missed an entire concept, that we made something that was supposed to be a link and we made a div or something like that that just has JavaScript to behave kind of like a link. So we'll talk about those things that kind of come before the checks, and the checks can maybe help us later. And we're not going to get in the weeds of the example project that we have. There's a view component that we're going to look at later. It's not really important that it's view or what version of the framework we're in or any of that. We're just going to look at its behavior. So getting back to what is web accessibility, to me, this is the core of it. It is us creating work that disabled people can fully and independently experience. The independent part of that is really important to me, especially through working with people making progress and other experiences before that. I've watched disabled users struggle to independently achieve things in software, and the reasons for that struggle can sometimes just be the code that was used. So you can't use a tab key to get to an interactive control, but you're not physically capable of using a mouse to click on that control. It's not available to you. You're prevented by the way the code was written from interacting with something independently. And this doesn't mean you can't do it. This means that in order to do something, you have to ask for help. And that's actually a really kind of complicated thing in certain situations, especially if you're using like your email or your bank or something. You don't necessarily want to have to go to someone else for help to do that. And in general, there's no reason that we can't write code in a way that works naturally with the tools that people need to use. So this, to me, is a focus not on checklists and on criteria that we have to match. It is, can people independently meet their needs with our software? And how are we dialing that in as developers? This brings me to like the person-to-person communication, where everything that we're going to talk about, the semantic HTML that we choose, the way that we choose to represent state of what's open and closed, what's active or inactive, this is all like a hidden layer in the visual UI. So it doesn't really make a difference to what you see on the screen, but it makes a huge difference to someone who's listening to a page be announced by a screen reader or experiencing it in some other way using different assistive technology tools. So it's something that like we need to consider as communication directly between the code we write and a person who's going to receive information based on that code. I think in some ways we should be good at this stuff already. We're developers. HTML has been around for a long time. There's about 130 HTML elements, which is like if someone asked you to learn a language that has 130 words, you would think that would be pretty easy compared to English or other things that we're used to speaking. I think one of the things that happens when we're learning development, though, certainly the way I learned by what was blocking me. So I wanted to achieve something. I don't know how to do it. I Googled how to do it, and I learned that little patchwork piece of how to achieve what's blocking me. And depending on how you ask the question and what you already know, you can learn something that's functional, but only in your particular context. So you're not going to notice that you Googled how to make an image interactive and you found, okay, I can add a JavaScript click listener so that I can click on the image. You won't know that that doesn't work in all situations unless you've already had some exposure to what accessibility is. Maybe you've had family members who are disabled or something like that. So having this patchwork approach to learning development can leave you with gaps around accessibility. And you also maybe haven't been exposed to a company that is required to create accessible work, which is like for legal reasons. And I can't really fault people for this. If you don't know that you need it, I don't know why you would spend any time learning it. Even the word accessibility or the short version, the numeronym A11Y that you sometimes see, if you don't know what that means, and that clicking on it would tell you how to make your software work for disabled users, I don't really see why you would voluntarily seek to learn yet another thing when you're in the middle of learning a lot. So a real quick overview of just some things here that we're going to talk about on the left-hand side that I would consider good accessible practices. And on the right-hand side, the alternative versions of these where these are not accessible. And the feeling of not being accessible is it's unclear what to do. It's unclear how to do it. I can't achieve certain actions, stuff like that. So we have semantic HTML, which means meaningful elements like paragraphs, buttons, links, forms, tables, things that have context about the kind of content you're showing that explain the nature of the content. The alternative is div soup. We just write divs. We put everything into divs and it looks the same, but it has no meaning and no structure. It doesn't tell you anything about what you're looking at. In accessible applications, buttons and links all have names, even if you can't see them. They all have names that are unique and appropriate. In an unaccessible version of that, it's unclear what actions are possible. This might be because all the buttons look the same, have the same icon. That would be pretty bad. Or just they look different, but they have no label that's accessible to a screen reader or something. Likewise, we'd expect on the left-hand side, form fields have a correctly associated label, so you know when you're typing into the first name, second name field, something like that. And on the inaccessible side, you're listening to the page be announced. There's not a good label for each form field, so you're guessing what you're typing into. It's really hard for me to imagine someone being successful typing into a form with no labels and putting the right stuff there. If we have good color contrast, we can read the page. If we don't, it's hard to read the content. Focus state, which is not really something we'll look at too much here, but focus state is when you've navigated to a part of the page with your keyboard and you can see what element has focus. That little ring around the element can sometimes be removed for like style reasons, for visual appearances, for branding. But if it's gone, you don't know where your cursor is. You don't know what's going to happen when you press space or enter if you're on a controller or what it's going to do. And so all of these little elements contribute to something that is kind of accessible in the sense that I care about most in this independent navigation of the page, equivalent ability to skim the page and like jump between stuff like headings, versus over here, the experience is just like, what is going on inside this page? So we're going to talk about the accessibility tree. When we talk about communication, one of the things is like, how does this happen? So people who use assistive technology can listen to a page be described. They can check out a Braille version on a Braille printer or screen or something like that. And they can do other things that let them manipulate and understand and skim through the content. And it's not like we have to do extra work to like make a screen reader version of the website or something. What we do is we make our HTML in a certain way, and then the browsers create this thing called the accessibility tree. And then that's the API layer where other software and other hardware can use that accessibility tree to describe what's on the page to somebody with a disability who's trying to interact with it and perceive it. When we have that layer, it's then up to the third-party technology to implement that correctly and build on it. And there's always some nuances. You might find some particular screen reader is a problem or something like that. So it's not just like totally free, it always works perfectly. But the main thing is it cannot add information that you didn't put into the markup. So it can't tell from the visual appearance of something that that's the header element or the main navigation, or that this is a hamburger button that opens up a menu and that the menu is open now. It can't figure out any of that information if it's not placed in there in the code. So this is where I focus on code as communication. What we're doing there is not just meeting a standard. It's just like from a common sense perspective. If you were listening to something like this described, you would understand there's a bunch of buttons here and I can sort of guess what they do. And how that's achieved in code can actually be multiple different paths depending on your needs. But as long as the accessibility tree can be built correctly, most tools built on top of that can work well. Here's an example of just like 3 different kinds of accessibility trees. The first is the div soup we talked about. So in your browser, in your dev tools, you might see div, 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 div. And what that is just going to be translated as generic container elements in the accessibility tree. And they're not announced by screen readers until you encounter some content, but then it's just like disembodied content floating around the page. What is it? If we compare that to the middle, okay, cool, we have an article element here. Oops. And down at the bottom, we have like the document structure. So previously we had buttons and interactive elements. Here it's documents saying heading, paragraph, list items. You get all these cool little tools on top of this if you're listening to the page and using a screen reader. Like you get to learn how many items you're in a list before you start listening to it. Or you can have all of the document headings announced so you can understand the structure. Likewise, you can understand all the links at once. So the browser, right, the tool that you're using to announce what's on the screen is able to process it and make it more useful and more skimmable. And that way you can learn, for example, from the links, what are all the places I can go to from this web page? What's the kind of the core here?
I
So
was just going to interrupt
oh
you
yeah,
for
go
a
for it.
sec, Mark. Yeah, I think one thing that's cool that you're talking about this is like we've been talking about it in the disabled context, but there's also, you know, the use cases of like, for example, like when I go for a walk in the evening, sometimes I listen to a podcast, but sometimes I'll open up a blog post and I'll put it on the reader mode where I can just listen to it. And it's beyond painful to listen to a blog post if they haven't used semantic HTML, because it doesn't read, you know, like, so I just kind of wanted to mention that it's you know, you know, that or stuff like data entry too, which aren't necessarily people that are disabled. So it's like, I'm just really glad you're showing the accessibility tree and talking about this.
Yeah, it's great. You get some other like help from like for other tasks, right, that require things to be structured and for the nature of what they are to be clear. I do that same thing when I walk. I do TV shows sometimes with the subtitles turned on, and or not subtitles, but the audio description, so I can like listen to an episode of a TV show while I'm getting myself to walk, which is pretty good. Okay, so I wanted to talk about Google Slides just because it's a really easy example. We have it open. And I wanted to mention, like we talked a second ago, that this accessibility tree is not the DOM. It's a similar tree-like structure, but it is not made up of like DOM nodes when you think about a page. It's made up of other stuff. And so to show it kind of connecting, we'll just take one of these menu items here and we can see this is a div, but it's got a special attribute. Make it bigger. This ARIA role attribute that it's got here, and ARIA expanded. These are more advanced things you can do if for some reason you're not allowed to use a real button or you can't in a certain situation. I believe this could be achieved with a real button and doesn't have to be a div, but it works. And the reason that we know it works is if I come back to the accessibility tree, we're toggling between the DOM representation of this HTML element and the accessibility tree. It's a menu item. It's got this label. It's got this expanded false. And if I click it, we see expanded true. So you can start to imagine as we move through here, like we can see the state, which one is expanded is present in the accessibility tree. And if we look at the expanded one, did I just close them all by clicking away? Yeah, this may happen when we lose focus. But anyway, you get the idea that there's things in here. We don't spend too much time on that. And that what's in here is labels. We see there's something called a tab in here. We can click through to all sorts of stuff. So if let's get out of that. Look at this one. Yeah. We can see this button for slideshow. It's just got text inside. And if we go back to the HTML view, it's div with roll button. So not my favorite pattern. When you do that, you have to do extra shenanigans like this tab index 0 that you totally get for free when you don't have a div. So there's some extra work happening around here. You don't actually have to do all this work if you have used semantic HTML, but the important thing is not exactly that you use pure semantic HTML everywhere. It's that you get the right accessibility tree. This looks exactly the same as if it was a button element. And because of Google's work on keyboard accessibility, it's going to behave the same way as well. And so I wanted to take a quick peek at that. There's actually so much more we could do just poking around Google Slides, but we'll move on. I think this is like a part I put in here because I wanted to talk about where accessibility starts. And when we're going to maintain an accessible component, that sort of implies we have an accessible component to begin with, which means we're able to recognize the accessible implementation of something. And that happens as a front-end developer when you're breaking down the design you've been asked to build and you're coming up with a component architecture and you're dealing with like, how are we going to achieve this thing? And sometimes we can dive in and start building. And when we start building, we often build from the bottom up. We make the smallest pieces, then we make the component that is the parent of those pieces, then we make the component that combines multiple components together. And that's actually a really natural way to evolve an architecture based on how these composable pieces come together. But the user experience is actually usually the opposite, where we see entities that are big and they have parts, and we look down and we see the smaller parts of the entities, but we're generally looking at like large objects and patterns. So instead of a carousel, we see, instead of like a button, right, that triggers a carousel, we see the whole carousel pattern. We see tabs as a pattern, not the individual components that make up the tabs. So the way I would break down a page, this is a section we're not going to get into like doing this exercise too much, but I would look at the big sections of a page and the subsections within those. And then I start looking for components. Then I'm looking for underlying patterns for widgets. And this is like, okay, this is a tab interface. I could drag that together with divs and make it work, or I know that there's an existing tab pattern. So we can use the idea of a pattern to make coding easier because we can go and get an off-the-shelf thing, and to make accessibility and maintenance easier because we know what the user expectations are for a certain defined pattern that we're implementing. So this is a hugely helpful thing. And then we save our divs and spans for like layout, for totally inert grouping, where we actually want generic elements. We don't want like an article in an article in an article just because they're semantic. If there's a need to nest them, we nest those things. But generally, you can still have lots and lots of div and span elements and just have their generic feature be actually what you want them for. So to summarize this, I would say accessibility starts before you write code. It's how you figure out what code you need to write. If we think about testing, sometimes we think about test-driven development, and that's very much a case of what's the behavior I want to see? Okay, define a little piece of that behavior. Now, what is the code that satisfies that test, that makes it pass, that implements the behavior? When we're like interacting with a website through a test, and we write a script that chooses elements and that clicks something, maybe asserts that it had an expected result. What we're doing can hold the application in a very code-focused way. We can say, give me a div with ID main. And within that div, I want to find something else with class header. And we can navigate and assert things in a way that's like really moving through unimportant information about the DOM. On the other hand, we can do something that starts with the user-focused thing. I want there to be a main element, and I want it to contain an H1 tag that has this particular title. And that's a feature that is not dependent on any coincidences, like what our class names are, what's our DOM hierarchy, or anything like that. We're focused just on what does a user need to experience here, and how can that be described? And so the way your test holds your application is really similar to how the accessibility tree works and how a user's assistive technology will hold your application and describe it. So using that door to like be the way you interact with your application is kind of the core of this, which means we have to understand up front, if we're going to test it, what's it supposed to be? There are some different kinds of UI patterns we might talk about. We're going to specifically go into the third one today, the thingy, which is what I call a pattern that combines other patterns, and it's hard to recognize what it is, and it's super tempting to just make divs for those. But up the top, there's the more easy stuff, like Nick kind of mentioned this earlier too, that like blogs, news articles, forms, it's pretty clear what to do, and semantic HTML works really well. You don't need any extra bells and whistles like ARIA and things like that. The next set is the conventional interactive JavaScript content. This is where you're likely to find an off-the-shelf component that works with your framework. So you can Google accessible tabs in React, and you will probably get something that's pretty good. You should still be skeptical of the implementation. It should make sure that it actually satisfies your users' needs for accessibility, but you have a starting point for understanding the pattern there. There's a whole bunch of other patterns that we can consider implementing. So we have accordions, carousels, buttons, combo boxes. This is all defined in this ARIA authoring practices guide. And these are the types of things we should be looking for, like breadcrumb is a pretty good one. This is just looks like links, but what's the underlying pattern there? As we see these, especially like disclosure, show and hide, we should be looking at designs to work backwards and say, okay, from this design, how much of it is made up of recognizable things, of known patterns that are easy to implement well, that users have expectations around? And then everything else is either content or it's a thingy. And you have to think a little harder about the thingy aspect. And oh yeah, what I was going to say, while thingies look unique and innovative, and often we get innovative designs from people who are working to make new, interesting user interfaces, they're often combinations of existing patterns. So even if it doesn't look like a particular thing, it's sometimes possible to combine 2 or 3 other patterns in a way that is logical and is kind of your best option. So we're going to look at a thingy. We're going to talk about some requirements for a thingy, and we're going to talk about like how we would go about building it. To build up this layered diagram, that's my example. I think I have a video. Yeah, let's start with this. So this is like a video you might get from a designer showing the behavior that they wish, right? That they've used an animation library or something to explain what this is supposed to do. I'm simulating scrolling the page, and as you read about avocados, you scroll and this diagram reveals like internal layers, and there's these highlights within the layer, and you can click a highlight, and within that highlight there's yet more content. So even interactive links at the end of the highlight, and there's images and stuff like that. So this is like a challenging thing from a development perspective because of the nested data, because of the scroll behavior, because you might have content authoring requirements where this is not just a static example thing. This is something you might expect to pull content from a CMS with JavaScript, put it all in the right place, and make the interactivity happen. So these are all the requirements that we have that look pretty short, but especially under pressure, you want to get something out the door, you want to get things working. It's really tempting to just start building and make something that works, and then figure out how you're going to get the dynamic content in there. And then later, if you're lucky, you might figure out how you're going to make it accessible. And so I've fallen into that before, and having to back out of a complicated component and think, okay, the markup is wrong. And if the markup is wrong and I have to fix the markup, all my JavaScript listeners are in the wrong place, and they're listening to elements that are about to not exist after I fix the markup. So it's like hard to back your way out of that and start fresh. You often won't have time to do it. So the way I would approach this is to like get those requirements and then start to talk with your designer or your product owner or whoever it is on your team that you would discuss as a front-end developer. How are we doing this implementation? You start to think about what's the goal of this? What's it going to do when there's reduced motion switched on? That's a really good question to ask to figure out what is the exact nature of something. Because this scroll behavior is sitting on top of something else, right? We have a thing that can have a sequence of multiple slides or something, and they each behave a certain way. So if a user has reduced motion, are we going to still do this fade? This fade up that happens kind of lifts the card away, and that implies that we're moving through layers in a specific order. But like, how could we communicate that if we didn't have access to the motion? It's a really useful question for designers. That brings about the question of like, what's this closest to? And working from the outside in, what's the outer layer of this closest to? And then it might contain other patterns in the sections. But like, if it's hard to figure out what it's closest to, it might actually not be that clear of a design in general. So you can ask about, can we add missing labels? Like, this looks like it could be tabs. If there were tabs or there were slideshow controls around this, it would be more obvious to users what the sequence is. If you're going to describe it over the phone, that's a really good way to think about what should be in the accessibility tree. What are you having to explain to someone so they understand the concept of this UI? And then what about some compromises? Like, okay, someone doesn't want to have controls showed all the time. So we could show controls only if we detect that you've turned off reduced motion or something like that. I actually really don't like customizing an interface to work one way for disabled users and another way for everybody else. But sometimes as a compromise and make a pragmatic decision to get something done and show that it's not so bad, you can think about those things. I have a particular implementation that I like for something like this. The core of it is expressing the structure in semantic HTML. And I think I can just like swing over and show this. So this is an example of how we might organize the content using semantic HTML for this avocado widget. We have, an internal header that says this is the diagram, and we have all this content here. And the real reason for me to do the content this way is that I'm picturing somebody who's a content author working in a content management system who has to create all of these items. And I want them to see something that makes sense, where they can see what headings they've made, what items there are, what are the links that they've authored. And so when they go to edit this, they can see the edits no matter what the JavaScript state of the component is. So there's already a reason for me to have some plain text version of it. The reason to make it structured like this is that not everybody has JavaScript. So, okay, we have a fallback for JavaScript. We have a diagram. All of a sudden, we have this interactive diagram that could be printed, which is pretty interesting and unusual, but very effective if you wanted to print something like this. And we have content that can be read aloud sequentially. So you can actually offer this as a fallback experience, kind of like alt text. If your implementation is too complicated and interactive based on, everything else that's going on the page, it's also, once the data is structured, totally possible to just create this alternate interactive version that is actually not interactive, right? This flat version that lets you see, okay, here are the individual things. Within that, we have certain elements. Within the elements, we have all the nested structures. So the accessibility tree for this looks like what it is. And that meets the needs of one set of users, potentially. This might be useful for someone who's listening to the page. It doesn't make any sense for somebody who's using the keyboard and is just like navigating and wants to see it, but that's okay. We have a JavaScript version. That's what we're asked to build, so we're building it. On the right-hand side, you can see a little preview of a bug we're going to fix in a minute, where the link is labeled with a disk. And if we turned on a screen reader and listened to it, it would announce like, disk number 5 or something here for each link. And of course, what are these links? These are part of a tab list. So we're kind of getting ahead of what the next part of the presentation is. We first of all have the HTML, and then we're going to enhance that through like a progressive enhancement strategy, where then it gets to be interactive. And it's interactive in this way, right? Here is how I've decided to represent the layers. Definitely weird things are happening when I scroll this, but oh yeah, I realized what was going on here. This was like a very limited demo app where the behavior in scrolling is not exactly super polished at big screen sizes. But this is how we would navigate through the sections if we did not have scrolling or motion enabled. And that would let us move through and use them. So we have this interactive layer that doesn't require the user to have motion turned on, but then we can enhance that with the motion by turning on this scroll behavior here. And now as I scroll, things are available. It's linked. If I scroll real slowly, I can go back and forth. This is powered by GreenSock, and this is like the actual end product that the designer delivered is the deluxe version with everything possible turned on that somebody can see. And the in-between progressive enhancement versions are fallbacks for people who've got different settings, but we can have keyboard interactions. We can have moving between these, picking one, switching to it, come in, open things up with the keyboard here. I'm just using tab, enter, space, things like that to navigate through the tab pattern. And this is, to me, like an acceptable compromise for doing something like this. I might prefer just not to have this. I would love to be convinced of it's really valuable to the company to have strange, interactive, distracting scrolling things as you're reading an article. I maybe have that conversation as well, but like this is okay. So we kind of saw there, what are the existing things, right, that we can tie together? We didn't look in too much detail yet, but we saw that we had interactive clicky things in the middle, and we had like a tabby pattern on the outside. Didn't really look like tabs, but I think it is still the closest match. So we're thinking about how can we combine and match the existing patterns that we're already looking for to make something that's still functional, even if it's complicated. So to me, the outermost layer is closest to tabs. that idea that we have discrete sections. I decided tabs was better than a carousel type format because each tab is interactive because we have extra dots on them, and the dots expand more content. So to me, that seemed more like it made sense in tabs. When I think of a carousel, I usually don't think of too much interactivity. I think of like one image or something at a time. And then opening and closing something is a pretty normal pattern. So we have disclosure patterns for this. And given that the expanded dot content can also have interactivity, that would be a question of like, what do you do in the authoring interface for the content management system? How much do you allow them to have custom HTML in there? Can you nest further components? Not worried about that right now. Just plain HTML in there. So the implementation that we saw was the plain HTML version that covers authoring mode, absence of JavaScript, and gives you a transcript or alt text version of it. In the interactive JavaScript version, I'm using Vue3 accessible tabs, a component that I Googled for, and the headless UI popover component, which is also something I'm familiar with, that lets me do these patterns with all of the ARIA and stuff that is supposed to be there, the role for tab lists, the keyboard behavior for hopping between tabs. All of that works because the component that I used implemented it. So we don't have to actually get into weeds of how to do that as long as we're able to understand what it's supposed to do and test it in a way that actually implements those things. GSAP, which is GreenSock animation protocol for motion and scroll behavior. And then we're using some Vue reactivity to tie it all together to make the scrolling trigger, the tab switcher and stuff like that. So there is some JS like visual stuff happening under the hood here that you might not think at first. Like when this slides away as we scroll, it's actually like a duplicate of the image that slides away. We've officially flipped state to the next tab, and we're just kind of putting something in the DOM that's not there in the accessibility tree, which is this image that's moving and fading. And we're doing that as we go down as well. Because one thing about a tab list is you can only have one active at a time. So when you see this design that says, okay, the old one is fading away, that for a little while got me stuck because I thought the old one is still here and gone at the same time. And, you know, I had a kind of crisis until I decided to just make it a visual experience, not a content remaining on the screen. So there are some bugs here. We just looked at one. We noticed it in the accessibility tree that like this has a label, and it's got this label because it's attached to this thing. And if we look at our element again, this is a link to navigate between the tabs. And this is a pattern that comes with that third-party library. I think it's probably good that it's a link that seems to be matching other tab implementations I've seen, but I haven't looked up if this is exactly the perfect linking behavior. Maybe it should be buttons, but it's got this character in here. And if I were to change this, we can see over here on the left-hand side, it says test, everything still works, and it goes away again because it's been injected with JavaScript. But this is not descriptive. So if I was listening to this be announced, I wouldn't know which tab was which or what was going to happen. And we can fix this and we can test for this. So let's see if we have Cypress open already. Oops. So we'll open up our test and we'll take a look at this test here, which has some warnings in here for bugs for us to fix. And I don't know, I've got lots of yellow lines. Oh yeah, I'm using different like linting rules. So let's ignore the yellow lines. But the test visits the page. It only asserts like one thing, right? Do I have the H2 of the diagram? Okay, great. Then we check, do the tab control interactions work? If I click on certain things, what happens? And I can see, oh, I have a test here that's not really doing a lot to like notice that the link is not working or not, doesn't have an accessible name.
Quick note, Mark. Do you mind just zooming in once or twice?
Yeah, thank you.
I'm able to read it.
This is probably a lot better. We good here?
Yeah, no, it's more for the recording when folks catch it later. So
sweet. Yeah,
perfect. Yeah, that's great. Thanks.
I'm gonna remove some of this clutter as well. Yeah, I think this will make it a lot easier. Thanks for catching that.
Yeah,
Cool.
no worries.
And so here we can look through the test and we can see, okay, on the right-hand side, it's going to highlight, if I actually pin this, it's highlighting this one here because that matches the rule, right? I wanted to go into the diagram. I wanted to find the link that was the second item in the array. So 1, and then I want to click it and assert what happens. And so the behavior here is correct. We're testing the behavior correctly, and we've moved on to this one. We expect that we'll have this thing, right? But our test is only caring about like the code, not the accessible name. And we can't use an accessible name because these links don't have an accessible name. So to fix that, we'll go into our avocado information component. And we'll think about what would we put here. So right away, I'm just going to put hi. And I'm going to rerun the application tests. In fact, it'll be easier to see this just in Chrome. So we've got them all saying hi. That's not great, but we know what information we have. We know that we're using some information. So I'm going to put the actual name of each layer. And we'll see how that looks. Okay, cool. Outer shell, flesh of the fruit, seed. This doesn't match the design. So the way to get around this, I'm going to copy this descriptive part that I want to have in there for screen reader purposes. And we'll back up so we actually end up having both. We have this thing. Too far. How far did I go? Yep. And then we have this one. And so let's see, this is a little bit of progress, and I just want to separate which ones are going to be displayed and which ones are going to be announced to screen readers. So I can use aria hidden to say this icon is meaningless, right? We don't care about it. We want it to just not show up in the accessibility tree. And then I have a class that hides things with CSS, but leaves them in the DOM. So this is SR only or screen reader only. This is a pretty common pattern where now this looks right. And if we inspect it and we look at the DOM, we can see both of these are here. And then we switch to the accessibility tree. And it's there with both of them. So actually, I'm not totally sure why that is. I don't think I have time to get into debugging that because with aria hidden, maybe it's as simple as this.
Oh, you got to give it a value, I guess, kind of like the disabled equals whatever.
Yeah,
you can put anything.
I think so. So let's find out. Yeah, now it just says outer shell. So right, it could just be aria disabled equals aria disabled or something like that. Cool. So this is the behavior that we want in our accessibility tree. And so we can also use this in our test. We can see it says flesh of the fruit here. And let's go and get that exact text from the DOM. Because that's the second one. And so back in our test, we're going to have this behavior, but I would actually prefer to do sci dot. If they want to make sure it's an A element, it's still a link. It's exactly what we want. And I want to put the text. And then I'm going to remove this one. Go back to Cypress. Let's make sure we only run this test so we can more easily see what's going on. Cool. So now in our record, we can see here in the command log that we've still selected the same one. But we've completely separated the idea of what we want to click on from which order is it in the DOM, which element is it in relation to other elements, because that doesn't matter. What really matters is when you click on the flesh of the fruit thing, we end up getting the mesocarp. And we have behavior we can test like, okay, we open it up, we type escape, it should close. We can say that this should not exist. But this only matters because of like, we chose the one that has the title that goes with that. And in every case, when we're testing something and we have something that looks more like this, this doesn't really matter. This is probably better than nothing. We're saying, okay, it doesn't have a tab index, so the implementation of the library that hides things prevents you from being able to tap to them by setting the tab index, and we can kind of work backwards. That doesn't matter at all, though. This one is still broken, and we would want to fix it by adding a label in exactly the same way that applied to that node. And I'm sort of conscious of time. I don't want to get into too many of those things, but this transformation of this test to remove dependencies upon the code and to focus on what is exposed to users through the accessibility tree is how to do this in a way that means it doesn't actually matter. If I use a different third-party component that does not manage things this way, doesn't have a popover activator class, doesn't have a tab index, or something like that, that my test would be able to, currently what would happen is the test would break, it would fail because this popover activator class is something that's a component implementation detail. And this idea that sometimes it won't have a tab index is also an implementation detail of some other child component of the one that we're testing. This is all just stuff that will go away if we test it from an accessibility first mindset and we build it that way. Then we'll have much more stable things that we can hold on to in our tests, and coincidentally, they'll be more accessible. So that's kind of what I wanted to point out about that, and I think it's good to kind of leave that as it is.
Yeah, no, it's a really great point, Mark, and also I think it actually it makes writing the test easier too, because like you were saying, it's separating it from the code. So even you as a developer that might have built this, okay, where was it? What's the selector, the CSS selector again, versus, hey, okay, I just need to find this text and do what I need to do. So it's like a nice side effect of making things more accessible. At least in my experience, I've found it makes writing the test easier too. So
it does, and it makes it much easier to believe the tests and read them, like, and understand what they're testing. Like check the fourth div and make sure it says home or something is like not a test
yeah.
that tells me a lot about why is that correct. And I started like when I think about the name spec file, which is what we call tests in most situations, you're specifying the behavior. And the last thing I want to do is specify that this link should be the number 4 thing, unless it's really actually important, or specify that this CSS class that a user will never see in any way is like part of my application's correct behavior. It's really not. So as much as possible, the test should only depend on things that are like worth failing for, that are worth like having a CI blow up, and a class name changing is almost never worth it, or DOM structure changing is never worth it. But a label disappearing off a form field is something I want to know about, because that could implement the ability of a person to give me money. And like, that's what our business cares about. If you have a credit card form, you want all that stuff to work correctly for every single user so they can like give you money and buy your stuff.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's why if we come back to this, accessibility starts before you write your tests, just like we said, before you write your code. And it's how we understand the behavior we want. So it's how we understand what kinds of tests that we need. I'm about to link to a bunch of different resources, and I'll put the link in virtual coffee chat or something so we can link to the slides from there. But this is like the core idea to me of when we think about accessibility, it leads us to really good questions about what is the exact nature of the things we're building, how is it supposed to behave, and those questions are actually probably needed to be answered before it got to you as a front-end developer. But because other people might not need to know this information, they may not have considered all the details, and so like gradually it improves the health of your product process by working backwards and saying, oh, we're going to have these questions at development time. So please, when we design and when we think about features, think about, well, what's the pattern that they follow? What are we implementing? The main benefit of accessibility work is always the experience of a disabled user. That is the priority. And if we have to sacrifice something else in order to make that work, that's what we should do. So it's coincidental that it aligns really well with like correct behavior of our applications, having good processes. These are the things that we've talked about. But if you had to give up one of those in order to make something work better in a screen reader or whatever, then that's what you should do. That should still be the rubric that kind of answers every question. It's the only aspect of programming that makes any sense to me as an organizing principle for front end. That's sort of, it's objective. And you can say, okay, many questions can be answered by what's the accessible way to do it. Many things can be made faster by asking what's the accessible way to do it. And then deviating from that, like intentionally when you know you're doing it and you're taking on the extra work to do custom patterns, but like knowing one path is easier and better for users and less expensive is pretty good. So second point here is better processes. Asking these questions, like it starts with, oh, I'm about to implement this. What do I need to do? But later on, it moves back and back and back through the process to go like, okay, well, what is our accessibility strategy? How does this factor into like how quickly we can work, how predictably we can work? I think it's a little bit more predictable to have a standard of accessibility that's like how we're going to do things. And you have a good sense of the estimate, and you know if there's third-party libraries already that you can use. And then finally, better code quality. When I started to think about this, it changed like how I think about testing accessible code and testing all code, which is, it doesn't seem like it's the right behavior for my applications to not match the nature and structure of the content, to not always show what's going on in like the machine level, the code communication level. I can't actually conceive of anything else being more correct. And I start to think of a lot of our companies and a lot of our stacks as being like massive, expensive machines that make HTML. And often we don't make sure it's like the appropriate right HTML, which is such a tiny part of the total expense and a huge and important part for the experience of some users and for just like feeling like it's working correctly. If the main output of our whole companies is serving HTML to users, like we should have confidence that that is the correct HTML at all times. And that includes both what it contains and how it frames it through the accessibility tree. And then, like we said, it's a little bit easier to test. It's a little bit more readable. To have code this way, it helps you find your way through a document. If you see sections, nav elements, footers, as opposed to a pyramid of divs. I have a screenshot that I didn't show here, but it's much easier to get oriented in a long HTML document if the elements are like meaningful. So I'll share all these resources. This top one is fantastic if you want to actually see how somebody is experiencing the web with the screen reader. A lot of other kind of good starter, non-scary accessibility resources that are in this list. So we'll share that out. There's a couple things you can do after this talk. If you give money to people making progress, that is the best thing I think you can do today if you feel like it. You can volunteer remotely at RepCode, not have to be in Atlanta to do it. And Cypress has some job postings for various parts of the org, so you're welcome to check those out. And finally, we have a few minutes for questions. At least I can go past 12 a little bit, or 1. So Nick, I'll hand it back over to you.
Yeah, no, that was really great. I love this talk, Mark, and you know, it's a super important topic that you still see pushback in orgs sometimes, but I think orgs that do focus on this are the ones that will shine compared to others. And it's kind of funny, but like even if an org doesn't care about accessibility for some reason, if you can show them that like you're losing customers, i.e. money, because of things not being accessible, like, not that it's the best approach maybe, but like, if the evil air quotes CEO, isn't a big fan of accessibility, if you show them that like, hey, there's money that you're losing here, they might change their tune. So, and it's just a good thing to do if you can, right? It's like, it just, the web's for everybody. So, Kirk, you had a question.
Yeah, long-time listener, first-time caller. Great to be here. I really love that talk. Mark, that was great. And yeah, just kind of like going off. Like I really enjoy the framing of like just accessibility is just like at its core, like usability for all the people that could like interact with the space, right? Like, which is usually like my pattern for explaining like what I'm doing. I'm making this site usable for people who want to use this site, which, as you said, is sort of like a fundamental thing that we have to do. If it doesn't work, then it doesn't work, right? Like we don't work if it doesn't work. So I really appreciated that. I guess, so the question I had, like you showed a really good example of taking a non-trivial like piece of UI and then like how do we work with that to sort of like make that design achieve our standards, which I like the standards of usable for the people who want to use this site. I guess my question is, do you ever encounter, or like how frequently do you encounter like designs or patterns proposed where it feels like we cannot reconcile this? Like the thing you want to do is, we can't do what we just did, where like using the sort of like ARIA semantics and just like hidden feet, like there's no way to get this thing and also have this be usable for people who use this site. Like, does that happen frequently? Or are you of the opinion that like all design has a way to become like this? And looking at this, I sort of thought like when before we just used to have the website, and if you tried to open it on anything that wasn't the size of a standard computer monitor, it was just bad. And then we realized sometimes you just need to have like two very disparate designs to accommodate that. So like, is the solution there just there's one way with all these cool effects and there's one way that like is usable for everyone else? Is that solution, does that work every time? That's kind of where I'm going.
Yeah, it's been my experience that like most designs are possible. It's a small subset that are really hard to map to at least one or two patterns. And so often like it's an implementation detail. If you know the pattern that's supposed to be implemented, or you can figure one out that's like good enough, then you just do that because that's like your job on the front end. But you can make your job a lot easier by telling people on the design team the kind of hoops you're having to jump through, or like, why are the estimates high? Well, it's because we've invented a whole new idea here. And so hopefully communication is like healthy enough between those teams. I did used to work at an agency where sometimes we'd receive designs and the designs would come from a company who is not connected to us at all. They would just come through the client. It's like, here's the website that you're going to build. And in several cases, if the designs included something that was just like not accessible, I would just do the accessible way as the front end developer. And like, if feedback came back about it, which rarely happened, I would explain, this is why we started this way. And here's like, we can, remove all the focus styles if you want to. Here's the consequences of that. But generally speaking, you can like, if you have the front end implementation like in your control, you can do something to make the code right. And we're sort of the last line of defense of whether something's going to be an accessible experience or not. So hopefully you have cooperation from everybody else to make that happen. But otherwise, it's like, yeah, we should find a way by hook or by crook to get the code to be somewhat accessible. And even if we have to deviate from the design slightly, like deal with the consequences of that rather than just kind of ignore it, because it'll just never get talked about.
Works for me.
Yeah, it's a great point, Mark. And I think once it kind of becomes accepted in the work at your work that like we do accessibility, it's part of the flow, it makes the space safer, I find, to push back on things. Like I remember at my previous job, I just spoke to the designer. Like they had a really great design, but I did a quick check on the color contrast and it wasn't passing. So I just said, oh, by the way, here's the color contrast checker. I altered the color you have slightly. It looks pretty much the same, and it's accessible. And then they were very welcoming to that feedback, So I think once you get that culture going, and then it's not like a us versus them kind of thing, It's just like, hey, how can we get there and still make it accessible? And we're pretty much at time here, Mark, but I definitely encourage folks to continue the conversations on our Slack, or also once we do publish the video, feel free to drop questions in the comments of the recorded video too. And I just wanted to say a special thanks again, Mark. Thank you for taking time out of your day to present this to us. It was a really great talk. And just thanks everybody for checking it out. As I mentioned, the video will be posted online. I can't say exactly when because we're pretty much all volunteers here, so it's whenever it gets done, but it's usually pretty quick. And yeah, again, like I said, if there's questions or comments, reach out and in the Slack. And aside from that, just wish everybody a great day and a great weekend.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.
Yeah, thanks everybody.